Ukraine, of course, was part of the former Soviet Union, and it was dominated for many years by its neighbor, Russia. As we saw just recently, it continues to be dominated by Russia. You may recall that the Ukrainian president had negotiated a trade agreement with Europe, or the European Union, and the Russian president urged him not to sign it, and the Ukrainian president complied. I don't want to single out Ukraine, but in many parts of the world, political corruption dominates, trumps all political philosophy. There's the common goal of gaining power to gain wealth. And you certainly have seen that in other places in Eastern Europe. And my dealings with Ukraine is they're just like everybody else when it comes to that. So there's this strong undercurrent of gaining power to foster your beliefs and to take care of your people, and the way you do that is by taking away from the others.
It is a very corrupt society, and there's a lot of internal fighting. And there is fighting again because of if Russia is kind of more of a unified, then Ukraine is not. Ukraine is split in half between the pro-Western and pro-Russian societies.
Ukraine is very dependent on Russia for its energy supplies, but it was and remains the breadbasket of the region. The vast agricultural fields. You would swear that you're in Kansas just driving for hours, and the ground in eastern Ukraine towards the Russian border is just perfectly flat, and it just goes miles and miles of nothing but beautiful fields, well-maintained fields. And I've been in Kiev when the Orange Revolution 4 years ago that eventually led to Yulia Tymoshenko's election as president. The Ukrainian people have a genuine commitment to their own independence. And as you interact with the people, you'll go down to the town square in Kiev, and it'll literally be covered with tents with people who will stay there for 6 months, 8 months, a year at a time to show their commitment to whatever policy issues they're fighting for. Economy is struggling, but Ukraine is such an interesting place because the big city, Kiev, you'd be surprised or overwhelmed with how much wealth there is in Kiev, how many $75,000 and $100,000 automobiles are on the streets. And when you go into the shops along Krashatnik Avenue, just incredible wealth there. But then just a few miles outside the city, if you take the train, as I have, from Kiev to one of our factories in the far eastern part of the country, you would swear that you're stepping back into the 1930s. The train ride would take 12 or 14 hours, and you feel every bump and rut on the rail. It's constantly stopping. It's just traveling just a few miles an hour. I mean, again, you feel like you're taking a giant step back in history. And it was a great experience to see that. And then once again, you get to a big city, and the big cities are fully modern. It's just everything in between that's stuck in the past. We have, of course, the U.S. Embassy that's in Kiev, and we do have a military contact team that's there. We do not have any military presence as far as there's no U.S. military bases or anything there. And the primary aid that we have militarily is through joint exercises. We occasionally do a joint exercise with the Ukrainian. This was our attempt to help bring them a little bit closer to NATO. We've significantly increased U.S. presence commercially in Ukraine since the early 1990s. There's a number of pharmaceutical companies that have built plants in and around Kiev. You have a moderately well-educated labor force that is paid very low wages. So you have, again, these very bright, articulate, well-educated people, and they just need a job. So many American companies have built factories there. The work that I've done with Ukraine has all been with government-owned entities, but all the workers were civilians. They just worked for a government plant. And what I thought was really interesting that contrasts so much with the United States is we were going to factories that had been largely closed for 10 years or so. And I would say, well, where's the workforce? And they say, oh, they're still here. You know, just because they lost their job when the factory shut down didn't mean they relocated. This is their home. They stayed there. And so we were able to rehire the same workforce that had been working at the plant 5, 8, 10 years ago when the plant shut down. And they were in many cases using some of the same old equipment, the overhead cranes and everything, it still worked, but it was the same crew because the people did not relocate. Here, if you close a factory, yeah, they'll move to California or to Michigan or someplace go wherever you could do to find a job, but not in Ukraine.
I think we have a healthy relationship with Ukraine. One of the things, Americans don't need a visa to go to Ukraine. You just get on an airplane, you show up there. A lot of Americans have businesses there and doing things, a lot of Europeans. I was just in Kyiv and Odessa, and there is French, German, English, you hear everywhere.
Ukraine has a number of challenges. One is a fairly large country, both geographically and population-wise, but it's dwarfed by its eastern neighbor. And the Russians not only had controlled Ukraine when it was part of the former Soviet Union, but now tremendous influence over Ukraine as far as trying to keep Ukraine from turning westward. They want it to remain its strategic partner because Russia supplies energy and gets food from commodity goods, foodstuffs from Ukraine. Russia wants a buffer between it and Western Europe. That was the whole reason that the old Soviet Union had occupied Poland and Eastern Europe and all to create a buffer so that if there was a war between Russia and the West, it would be fought on the middle ground and not on Russian soil. And now with many former members of the Warsaw Pact having joined NATO, NATO is right up to the border of Ukraine now, and Russia is just trying to keep that buffer. And so it's strategically important for Russia to continue to dominate over Ukraine. I've been in Kiev when the Orange Revolution 4 years ago that eventually led to Yulia Tymoshenko's election as president. I had a number of meetings at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs during that time period, and it would take us 2 hours to get through the crowd. And nobody was blocking us, but the crowds were so big and so intertwined that we can't turn on sirens and part the Red Sea or anything. We had to walk and just meander through and then get to the gates, and the gates are all closed. You got to wait for the checks and everything. It was just a burdensome process, but at the same time, you sense a genuine excitement on the part of the people that they knew that they were protesting, supporting something that's real. And they were committed, and you got that sense of commitment from their excitement. You had a pro-Western and a pro-Russian candidate, and they were supporting the pro-Western candidates. The Ukrainian president had negotiated a trade agreement with Europe, or the European Union, and the Russian president urged him not to sign it, and The Ukrainian president complied. So what we saw in the last couple of weeks with the decision by the Ukrainian president not to sign the trade agreement is the same sort of revolutionary fervor that we'd seen in the past, and they're occupying the city hall, which is right down Kiev on the main avenue, just down from the square that anytime you see pictures of Ukraine, you see the town square. The city hall is just 2 blocks away. Krashatnik is the name of the road there. But anyway, in my opinion, it's very real, and that the president's got a problem. The days are gone where he can just do a crackdown. We haven't seen a crackdown where imposing violence on the Ukrainians in 40 years or so. And I just don't think the people today would stand for it.
Ukraine is split in half. There is a pro-Russian side of Ukraine that's closer to Russia, and then there is a pro-Western Ukraine, which is closer to Poland. One society says we ought to be more like Russians, the other one says, hey, we ought to be more like the West. The government now in Ukraine is pro-Russian. The opposition is in prison because it is criminal to oppose the government. So the young people in Ukraine saying that's not how we want it. We see how the other young people live in other countries. To the right of us, they don't live very well. They haven't advanced too far. And the only reason they have fancy cars and expensive clothing is because of the oil price. And then we see the way the people on the left of us live that have things that are maybe not so materialistic, but they're definitely healthy. There's a medical system, there's fire department, there's police department, there's these things. And the young people, they tend to be more revolutionary, so they go and they protest in Kiev. This is what they protest. If they get closer to Europe and they become part of this European Union, then they have to play by rules. Then there are going to be observers during the elections. There's going to be more control over the government. And they would have to be more transparent. If they go closer with Russia, then the opposition is going to be in prison. So young people decided that they rather have more organization that would criticize the government and not end up in prison.